Let's talk about complexity as a criterion that any undergraduate writer working on an essay about literature should keep in mind. This lecture is a somewhat extended version of what is already included in my one-page handout on complexity, which is also copied at my webpage on complexity, where this video is embedded and where you may be watching this. Feel free to follow along with those texts as I talk. If you've received feedback from professors saying things like reductive, simplistic or oversimplified, too pat, too easy, or any instruction to include something that you didn't include, then this is a criterion that likely requires your attention. If your essay claims to present a thesis on a literary subject, right? Your essay in theory claims to present an argument, a thesis on some subject of literature. But then when it does so, it presents pat simplifications or tidy statements of fact, then you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing in this form. If you are presenting pat simplifications or tidy statements of fact in something that's ostensibly an essay about literature, then you are either being shallow, that is the opposite of being deep, and I'll encourage you to see the depth page for that. B, you could be being reductive, by which I mean you're glancing over or removing the rough edges of something that is more complicated either than you're letting on or more complicated than you realize, right? Being reductive is speaking about something that is complicated as though it is simpler than it is in a way that does damage to our ability to understand and talk about that thing. Or, and this is most common I think, you might not be writing about literature at all in the essay that is supposed to be writing about literature. You may be committing what we call the heresy of paraphrase. That's a term coined by Cleanth Brooks. The heresy of paraphrase is when you confuse the work of literature itself with a summary that you've imagined or perhaps that you've read about that work of literature. Right? So when you confuse the literary work with a summary or outline or gist or basic point or main idea or main theme of that work. Right? So the heresy of paraphrase, again, is treating the paraphrase as though it is the work itself, forgetting that the whole point of literature, what makes literature literature, is that it does something more than a paraphrase of its content could ever do. You can find a link to Brooks's full essay on the heresy of paraphrase in the page in which this video is embedded below. But don't commit to heresy of paraphrase. The job of the humanities scholar is always to think through a complex inquiry. It is never to provide a simple answer. In the process of arguing your complex thesis, it will certainly be necessary for you to express some simple ideas along the way. However, it must always be clear that when you're presenting those simple ideas, you're presenting them by building toward or making possible an inquiry that is complex. Literature is fueled by complexity, by ambiguity, inquiry, imperfect reflection. Straighten out the tangles, and it dies. I'll say that again. Literature is fueled by complexity, by ambiguity, inquiry, imperfect reflection. Straighten out the tangles, and it dies. Again, your job is not to simplify. Your job as a writer about literature is never to simplify things or summarize things. Your job in an essay about literature is to complicate, to help make literary texts reveal their literariness, peel away the layers. Some ideas for how to do that are the following. For starters, this is a preview of the depth handout. I never know which handout to put this in, so I put it where it fits. It fits both, but I'm going to talk about it in both lectures. So I'll say it once here and once there. Read against the grain. Think about cutting wood. If you cut wood against the natural alignment of its fibers, you end up with rough edges. It's not something you should be doing if you're, say, making some furniture. You want to cut with the grain, probably. But for literary analysis, you want rough edges. Rough edges are vital to literary analysis. To read against the grain, which is a term coined by David Bartholomew and Anthony Petrosky, first you got to find the grain of the work. That is the way it seems to want to be read, the thing its author function sets out to do. By author function, I mean the apparent aim of the author, let's say, or the apparent idea of the author. So find the grain of the work. Find where it seems to want to take you, where it seems to want to be read. Number 2, challenge that smooth implicit reading. revealing its inherent contradictions, controversies, contingencies, paradoxes, and then breaking those apart. Reading against the grain asks, does a text do what it seems to set out to do? And then it asks, what does a text's doing or not doing what it seems to set out to do? And if you're really complexifying, ask, how does the thing that a poem does by doing or not doing what it seems to set out to do or not do what it does? That's complicated. It might be worth repeating that to yourself a few times. How does the thing that a poem does by doing or not doing what it seems to set out to do or not do what it does? But if you can answer that question, or start to answer that question, it's the beginning of a complex and deep argument. This is not the same thing as identifying irony or ambiguity. In fact, irony and ambiguity often offer the smoothest grains of all, right? And you can see the author's gears working to get you there. Instead, look for when the author function seems most clearly to say, and again, author function by which and this is a very brief summary of what Foucault means by author function, the author function being the apparent imprint of the author on the text, or the apparent presence of the author in the text. Look for when the author function seems most clearly to say, see what I did there? When everyone in class seems to agree about and be dazzled by something, but you're not convinced. So that's complicated, but we'll go over it again as well in the depth lecture. But that's what we mean by read against the grain. And reading against the grain is the beginning of any good and complex literary argumentation. From there, to continue a sort of tree-oriented metaphor, ramify. To ramify means to branch out. When we say consider the ramifications of what you're saying, we mean that something that happens always branches into other things, right? Something that's said always branches into other things. So ramify. Use if-then statements. I'll refer you to the rigor page for that. And dig deeply. I'll refer you to the depth page for that, so that you find a cause for every effect and think through an array of effects for every cause. Find a cause for every effect and think through the array of effects for every cause. In your drafting process, allow your argumentation to branch out. Then hone in on one branch by understanding it in relation to the limb. Home in on one branch by understanding it in relation to the limb, the trunk, and the roots from which it grows, and to every twig, leaf, and fruit that branch produces. You prune those ramifications with focus, making sure that it's a focused argument when you edit. Now, in my focus talk at the focus page, you'll remember I discussed ways to limit your argumentation to truly logical, necessary structure. But your problem might not be limiting, but expanding. If so, then flip my advice on focus on its head. Rather than asking, is point N truly necessitated by point I? Ask, what further points might point N necessitate? Or what further points might points N and P necessitate? And you'll see this is again a flash to the focus talk. But you'll see here, let's say the writer came to point P and point N. Now we ask, ramifying, branching out further, what further conclusions might we draw from or ramify from points P and N? Right? In short, ask continually what further rigorous logical argumentation might rely on your current argumentation, might take the thing you're arguing as a given premise or as proof for what it's arguing. Next, look for trouble. This is a big one. Develop your hypothesis from a close reading that hones in on ambiguities, right, as we say in the specificity talk, rather than from broad ideas and assumptions you already had before you started, right? So always start with something ambiguous to start with. But from there, seek out evidence that unsettles, undermines, or disproves your hypothesis. See the rigor handout, or the rigor page. Or that makes it redundant. See the innovation page, right? Let's say you're researching something and you're really into the argument you're making, and then you're close reading something and you're really into the argument you're making, and then you start researching it and you realize someone's made a very similar argument already. A lot of people go, oh no, I've been scooped, but that's not true. If someone's already said something similar to what you've said, then you get to branch out from there. That will force you to continually, sorry for the noise in the background, that will force you to continually re-articulate your hypothesis to adjust to challenges. And it's important here to consider prompts and feedback from your professor or instructor. Prompts and feedback from your professor and instructor often urge you to include, cover, or consider a topic that you wouldn't otherwise connect or have connected to your hypothesis, right? So professors say, what about this? What about this? A lot of times students respond to that by going, how can I fit that into my essay? I've already reached the word limit. But it's usually not an instruction to add tangential material to your essay or shoehorn it in sometime. It is probably more an instruction to use that new topic, use that thing they've thrown you as a way of looking at your thesis. Use it to complicate it productively, the way you might throw a grain into an oyster to produce a pearl. You think of it as a new lens to be used in studying the specimen rather than a new specimen to study. Whoops, sorry. Oh, jeez. So what I mean by that is when prompts and feedback give you a new topic that you hadn't included or hadn't thought to include, that doesn't mean to take a diversion. That means to throw that in to what you're already arguing to see what further ramifications go there. It will usually suggest something to you because we believe that there's a ramification in that direction that your argument is already moving toward. Remember, you're keeping your argument coherent and rigorously focused. You're allowing it to ramify outward, and you're using the trouble that might occur, the complications that might occur, or the new evidence that your professor throws at you as ways to ramify outward. Next, focus on form. I said that at the beginning of this talk, and I really meant it, right? If we focus on content, then we're already on the verge of paraphrasing, right? We're saying what the text says, not how it says it. But complexity tends to inhere in form, the how something is said, rather than in the content, that is, what is said. If your argument about a work of literature isn't centered fully on form, and that's usually the best choice, then it should at least be engaging with form fundamentally. And it should return again and again to form. Again, just in case you're not clear on it, you should be, but just in case you're not, by form, I mean form as opposed to content. Form is how you say what is said, whereas content is simply what is said. Content can be paraphrased. Form cannot, right? As you do so, I say distinguish the bow and arrow from the archer and the target, by which I mean distinguish the text from its author and audience. This is a metaphor I tend to use that tends to get the point across when I talk about the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy. I'll talk about both of those right now really briefly, right? And I'll use an example of the archer and its target, or the archer and his target, right? So let's say you witness the shooting of an arrow from a bow, right? Let's say the work of literature is a bow and arrow that shoots an arrow. Let's say I'm an archer, and I'm a bad archer, which I am. I've tried and I've learned that I am a bad archer. And instead of shooting the target that's immediately in front of me, I shoot my friend in the chest, which thankfully has not happened, right? You walk in and you see a bow shooting an arrow that hits a dude in the chest. Okay, here's what you don't know. You don't know what I was trying to do, right? You don't know what I as archer was trying to do. You don't know. Now, if you're in court and you're a lawyer, you're going to try to figure out what I was trying to do to determine my guilt. But if you're a literary scholar, what I'm trying to do in my head is not accessible to you. What you witness is what the bow and arrow have done. The bow and arrow have shot in that direction and hit that dude rather than that target. That's important information. Something else you also don't know is whether that guy was trying to be hit, or whether he was putting himself in harm's way, or whether he was trying to mess with, or he was just happened to be walking by. You actually don't know what's going on in his head either. All you have access to is the bow, the arrow, and the shooting of the arrow and the hitting, right? Let me talk about it in terms of literary text, right? So that's the metaphor, right? You don't know the author of a text. There's nothing that is more of a limiter on the complexity of an undergraduate argument than the oft-committed intentional fallacy. And that's a term coined by William Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley, which I'm filtering here through Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, very reductively summarizing all of this. The intentional fallacy is the specious idea that an author's intent can ever be known by the scholar, or that such an intent could ever be articulated or understood plainly, even by the author themselves. And especially that such an intent determines or governs the meaning of the author's work after it has been written. Utterances bear meaning independently of the utterer. You shoot the arrow, and you don't always get to decide exactly where it goes. In fact, you don't get to decide exactly where it goes ever. It helps to remember that the author's apparent identity, as received by any reader, emanates not directly from the author's mind, what's in here, but rather as a construction of the texts associated with that author. That's what we call the author function. And that author function, maybe, can be analyzed as a made object, as a product, not producer, of the text, right? So you can analyze the way that that arrow makes the archer look, but you don't know what's going on in the archer's head. You don't know what's going on in the writer's head. So when you say things like, Chaucer was trying to do this, you really don't know what Chaucer was trying to do. Removing that language will allow you to speak more complexly about the text because you have freed yourself from the idea of authorial intention, which is always inherently reductive and simplifying. Secondly, you don't know the author, you don't know me. You don't know what I receive when I'm reading a text. There's a lot of times that undergraduate writers will try to sidestep complex analyses by making claims about what people feel when they read something, or what readers think, or what we perceive. My supervisor used to get on me for using what she called the coercive we, right? As we open up The Wife of Bath's Tale, we realize that, right? The we. If you are planning on doing many years of surveys, right, perhaps raising the dead in the process, that's when you might begin to scratch at the fullness of the range of possible responses that any audience might have to a single moment in a text. Right? There's innumerable ways to receive based on how you're feeling that day, based on who you are, based on your identity, based on a number of things. And that's pretty extreme in its complication. So when you start creating a sort of imaginary reader and sort of imaginary homogeneous audience, you're always simplifying, right? And you're probably committing what Wimsatt and Beardsley call the affective fallacy. Again, you can only study the bow and arrow, not the archer and target, right? The archer being, I'd say, the author, the target being the audience, right? You don't know us, right? You don't know the author. Usually the author is dead. But you can study the bow and arrow and learn plenty about its aim. The literary work can have an aim and an effect without you starting to make guesses about what the reader or the author are thinking. Again, I'll try to say that clearly because I know this is it's talk on complexity. It's a complicated concept, right? The problem with the intentional fallacy and affective fallacy is that they oversimplify. The fact is, do not write as though you can guess at or should guess at what the author is thinking or what the audience is thinking. You don't have access to that. You have access to the text and what its apparent aims are and apparent effects are. But that's it. The difference is really key. Following on that, literature has no what's really going on here. Another really common oversimplification that I've seen undergraduate writers say is what it really is, what the Wife of Bath is really thinking. No fictional character is really thinking anything because fictional characters are not real. There's nothing that a literary text is really about. There's no secret code or message that your essay will suddenly reveal. And that, we've been reading this text for X number of years, but suddenly this one undergraduate writer is going to peel away and reveal what's really going on here next time on, right? No, right? It's not clickbait. There's nothing that a literary text is really about. There's no secret code or message that your essay will suddenly reveal about it. Behind any mask that you pull away from the text will be another mask. It's all artifice. What literary scholars are interested in is the way the artifice is constructed, the way the mask is built, how the mask works. I'm using a lot of metaphors here. The complex of illusions and impressions that arts create. The secret to all this is that it makes you a better person, too. A lot of what's going on and going wrong with present-day discourse is a tendency to grossly oversimplify everything. But there's a reason why the intentional fallacy is so wrong. It's not just because you can't know what's going on in an author's head. It's because what's going on in any human being or an audience's head. It's because what's going on in a human being's head, what's going on inside a human being's soul, is inherently so complicated it can't really be put into words. Life is complex. Simply to get through the day, we simplify. But in so many ways, life itself emotionally, culturally, and even biologically, is what happens when things get complicated. So to appreciate that, you have to complicate your view of it. And that's the beauty of the work we do in literary scholarship. Oddly, it seems appropriate to close here with the lyrics of the song that always ends up in my head when I give this lecture. I decided to actually work it in. I always wind up with the 2002 Avril Lavigne song Complicated, which is sometimes spelled with an 8, when I give this lecture. And maybe some of those lyrics will help you keep complexity in mind. It goes, "Life's like this. You fall and you crawl and you break and you take what you get and you turn it into honesty." Think about the ramifications there. The Avril Lavigne song suggests that complication is always bad, always fake. But that claim, if we take it seriously, is itself a complex one. What do we mean by fake? What do we mean by complicate, Avril? Complexity lurks everywhere, even in what seems simple. And you turn it into honesty when you acknowledge that. Because truth, especially in literature and lyric, is never tidy and cannot be uttered without complexity.